I'm not going to present a vision of what I think standards and credentialing should look like in secondary education. I'm hoping to give you some tools to think with when you look at your own systems. So there's no solutions here. And I think that's probably the most important part of my presentation, which is to say that there is no perfect assessment system. There are always trade-offs. And the big idea here is, what trade-offs are you making? So I'll share my screen. And I think people have got the slides already, so you can have these afterwards. But basically, I want to talk about two overriding issues in assessment reform. First of all, I think we need to understand why things are as they are, and then, and only then, understand that making changes involves trade-offs, which we can actually make explicitly by talking about the trade-offs and saying we're happy with these trade-offs, or we can make them implicitly without realizing what we're doing, and just they emerge as unintended consequences of the decisions we've made somewhere else further down the line. So in terms of thinking about change, I have found a short story by G.K. Chesterton very interesting. This has become known as Chesterton's fence. And so there's quite a long quote here, but I'm not going to go through it all. The big point is this. If somebody wants to change something, you ask them, well, why was it put there in the first place? And if they don't know why it was put there in the first place, tell them to go away and think about this. As Chesterton says, go away and think. Then when you can come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy this fence that you don't see the purpose of. And I think one of the things we have to be very clear about when we change examinations or credential systems is to understand why the things that are there. Because if you don't understand that, then you may be making rather unwise choices and you'll end up with unintended consequences. So looking around the world at secondary examination and credential systems, one of the things I've discovered is they often seem crazy when looked from outside. When I first looked at the American system with the SAT, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, as it was once called, it made no sense to me, because how can you figure out which courses somebody should be doing? But I realized that in the United States, selection for an institution is separated from placement. In the United Kingdom and in many other countries, selection and placement are combined into a single process. You can't apply to the University of Cambridge. You can apply to the University of Cambridge to do mathematics. And so your admission is decided by the department where you'll be doing most of your study. And so there you need information about how good somebody is at mathematics. But if you have a general system, then maybe an aptitude test has some possibility of providing information. The important point is things that look crazy from outside often make sense when viewed in context. So the SAT versus, for example, A-levels in England, or Abitur in Germany, or Baccalaureate in France. The question is, do you want information about a particular aptitude, or do you want general information? The other thing that's really interesting, particularly in the United States context, is one of the reasons that the SAT has been falling out of favor is because they've discovered that actually the high school grade point average is actually a better predictor of college performance than the SAT. And the reason for that is because the high school grade point average measures more than just intellectual ability. It also measures perseverance and conscientiousness, which are also important for success in college. So I'm not surprised when Linda said that they were finding that non-standard students admitted without high SAT scores did just as well, because of course they had those non-cognitive attributes. So some systems include cognitive attributes only, and some systems also include non-cognitive factors. Those actually play out very differently. But the big idea here is whenever we talk about change in assessment, proposals for change are usually really clear about what the old approach did badly and how the proposal will improve those aspects. And Linda made a very clear, convincing argument about what is wrong about the current system in the United States and indeed in many other countries. What I also find is that new proposals are generally silent about the things that the old approach did very well, but the new proposal will do less well. Let's take a concrete example. Many people argue for the inclusion of performance assessments, and I'm in favor of that, but here's the trade-off. It turns out that if you have performance assessments in a high-stakes system, the score you get depends less on how good you are at that subject, less on who does the scoring, less on whether you're having a good day or a bad day, and more on whether you were lucky in the particular performance assessment you were given. This is called person-task interaction in psychometrics. But we've seen this phenomenon everywhere, from middle school science assessment all the way through to medical education. When you have authentic assessments of performance, you bring in a degree of unreliability. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I think we should be aware that we're actually introducing a massive amount of luck unless we have a very large number of performance assessments. And the research suggests you probably need about 6 performance assessments before you're measuring really how good the student's work is, rather than how lucky they were in the choice of task they were assigned to complete. So my argument is that any proposal for change should say, what would be better if the changes are made, and what would be worse if these changes are made? And people need to answer both of those questions. And often people say, nothing will be worse. In that case, I think you probably need to think again, because there's almost always something that's going to be worse. You might be happy to make that trade-off. The important point is to be clear about those things at the outset. There will always be trade-offs. The question is how explicit they are. Okay, so let's think about it in more detail about what I mean by assessment. And I find the definitions from the work of Lee Cronbach back in the 1970s very helpful. An assessment is just a procedure for drawing conclusions. We give students things to do, we look at what they do, and we draw conclusions. And so the key issues in assessment are, first of all, the meanings. What do we know about the student from seeing how well they do on this particular set of tasks? Could be a multiple choice test, could be a performance assessment. So what conclusions are we allowed to draw? And the important point is, there's no such thing as a valid test. There's only valid conclusions drawn from the assessment evidence. But the other thing, and I think this is really important in terms of what Linda was saying, is that assessments are also important, not just for what they mean, but for what they do. Assessments have social consequences. They send messages to students and to other stakeholders about the things we think are important. And we also need to think about what are the effects on learners. So when students actually study for a test because it's the only test that matters, the question is then, what messages are we sending, what we care about, and how good are the students? How do the students change what they do as a result of those systems being put in place? And so there are 2 major problems that I think we always need to look at in any assessment. The first is the assessment is too big, scores depend on things they shouldn't, or it's too small, scores don't depend on things they should. So for example, we have irrelevant factors such as handwriting, luck, and assessments are often too narrow, particularly in the United States. We assess only things that are easy to assess. So I think the key takeaway here for me is that we can solve most of these problems if we actually define our constructs. We often debate about whether multiple choice questions are a good idea. The important point is that's not a debate about assessment, that's a debate about what you think is valuable. If you think that history is about facts and dates, multiple choice questions are great. So with good construct definition, assessment design is technical and people can agree about whether this is a good assessment. The construct definers are in charge. When we don't define the constructs well, values intrude into the assessment design, people will disagree about the adequacy of the assessment, and assessment developers are in charge. So we have to define our constructs appropriately in order to have a good assessment system. So finally, here is, I think, the 5 things that I think are most important in terms of designing an assessment system. We have to have it distributed, so we don't collect information just at the end, as they do in France and Germany and in England. We also have to have it synoptic, so you actually have to accumulate knowledge over the course. We have to assess all the things we care about, not just the things that are easy to assess. It has to be manageable, so we don't take up too much time in assessment, and it has to be trusted. There is no assessment system that will do all these 5 things. But by thinking about these 5 issues in assessment design, I think we can probably design assessment systems that are more likely to suit the particular context of a particular jurisdiction than just tinkering with pieces. Yeah, I'm arguing for a principled approach to assessment design.